This episode is sponsored by PAX, the gold standard in emergency response bags. So when you're working under pressure, you need kit to be both dependable, tough and intuitive, and that's exactly what you get with PAX. Every bag is handcrafted by expert tailors who understand the demands of personal care, from the high-tech, skin-friendly and environmentally responsible materials to the cutting-edge welding process that reduces seams and makes cleaning easier. PAX absolutely puts performance first. They've partnered with 3M to make perfect reflective surfaces for better visibility, and bright grey interior makes finding kit effortless and fast even in low light. With over 200 designs, PAX bags are made to suit your role, your needs and your environment. And thanks to their modular system, many bags work seamlessly together no matter the setup. PAX doesn't chase trends, their designs stay consistent, so once you know one, you know them all. And if your bag ever takes a beating, their in-house repair team will bring it back to life. PAX are built to perform, made to last. Learn more at pax/bags.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're looking at risk, pressure and the precision in HEMS operations with Diane Dollar. So we're joined by Diane, who is a pilot whose career really sits both at the intersection and stretches across frontline operations, HEMS operations, training, and the future of aviation workforce. Diane is a professional helicopter pilot and check airman for a major air medical operator with a background that spans tours, VIP charter, organ transport and aeromedical operations. So her journey into aviation began in the US Coast Guard, where she was exposed to search and rescue missions, and that really did spark a passion for flight, ultimately leading to more than a decade in the cockpit across diverse mission sets. But Diane's impact extends well beyond flying. So as the founder of Forever on the Fly, Diane is building pathways into aviation through mentorship, STEM, engagement, and large-scale Dare to Dream events. This is really designed to inspire the next generation and address the lack of diversity in the cockpit. So in this episode, we're really going to explore just what that breadth of experience means for HEMS, for decision making under pressure, and for the operational realities of mission risk, and how culture, mentorship, and training shapes safer, more effective crews. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, happy to be here.
It's great to have you with us, actually. Just as a framer, Dan, and just as an opener, could I get you to really maybe just walk us through just your approach, really, when you are tasked to launch? What are some of the things and maybe key variables going through your mind that you prioritize in those first few seconds?
Sure. And I will start by saying I no longer fly the line because I'm in the training department at this point, more fulfilling the role of training check airmen and ensuring that our pilots who are flying the line understand those variables and how to make those decisions. I used to fly the line for a previous company, so I do have experience in that realm where I can share my experiences, especially with new HEMS pilots. And we call it HAA here in the States. I don't know if they are doing that in the UK as well. Helicopter air ambulance at this point. Emergency medical services kind of implies that added pressure, I guess, making it more of a state of emergency rather than a flight request, which is also another factor that the FAA has kind of tried to wean on the side of, safer risk management and putting less pressure on the pilots and the crew to take these flights. So really, when the call comes in, by that time, you've already pre-flighted the aircraft. Typically, you've already done your own self-assessment and made sure that you are fit to fly, that your crew is fit to fly. And we could talk about that more extensively in a little bit. But number one is weather. We essentially are weather assessors and decision makers. I personally keep tabs on the weather in my area of operation at all times. So when that call does come in, the time period between getting the call and making a decision becomes a lot shorter. Where it kind of gets a little bit trickier is if you're taking a safety nap or, it happens in the middle of the night and you decided to sleep, getting waken up in the middle of the night to take a flight, you have to assess the weather fairly quickly to be able to determine whether or not you can take the flight or not. There are, ways that you can say, I can't get the patient all the way, but we can maybe meet you guys halfway. If you just need the patient to get closer to the destination hospital, we can kind of work things out and kind of give the requesters some options if the weather doesn't look good to go. The other factor would, of course, be duty times and rest for the crew and for me as the pilot. So we have required, maximum duty times and required rest that the crew and I all have to have. So I think, one of the variables is if it's towards the end of your duty time and another pilot is going to be coming on shift soon, does it make more sense to let them know, hey, we have another pilot who's coming on board. I've worked a 14-hour workday here in a couple of hours, or I'm going to duty out in the middle of this request. It does happen sometimes where we say, yep, my duty will allow me to get the patient to the hospital, but it won't allow me to come home. And in that case, I've had to drive quite a distance for the relief pilot to drive out to me where I was and for me to take the car and bring it back to the base after I completed my duty day, which in North Dakota, which is where I was based, could be fairly extensive, 2 to 3 hours of drive time after a 14-hour duty shift to get back home. So, the mission at the end of the day is to get the patient to the hospital safely, but it's not our job to be able to get ourselves home. So that's where the pilot and the relief pilot kind of have to work together and be willing to do things like that, which are not necessarily very convenient options. But so I would say those two key variables, weather, duty times, and of course, like I mentioned, if we've already verified that the aircraft is ready to go and ready to launch, and at that point, it's just human factors and weather.
Yeah, indeed. And it speaks to the wider team actually, Diane, because as you were saying, it's all the unseen factors, the fatigue, the logistics of trying to get home and indeed, get to a place of rest. And it's often those things that can aggregate over time. But could I get you to, when you're on a mission, Diane, the could you speak to us about, when conditions do start to deteriorate, either weather or indeed, yeah, just meteorological, environmental conditions? How do you reassess, and indeed, what drives your final decision?
Sure, and I would say that my threshold for weather for launching on a HEMS mission is a lot more conservative than a charter or a tour. And the reason being, with a charter and a tour, you could look at the weather on paper and you can say, well, it looks like it could get bad out there. We can poke our head out and just sort of see if it looks bad, we'll turn back around and land. We can't really do that in HEMS because all that's going to do is delay patient care. So if you say, hey, let's go poke our head out and see how it is, all you're doing, if you have to turn around or you're unable to continue the flight, it's delaying patient care. It's delaying them from rallying another asset, like a fixed wing asset or a ground asset, where they could be moving the patient. Because now they, are assuming that you're able to do the flight, and then halfway through you have to turn around. And so my minimums to launch for an HA mission or HEMS mission is a lot more conservative than potentially other things that we could be doing in a helicopter where we have the ability to say, hey, yeah, we can poke our head out. If it looks crappy, let's just turn back around. And some people are okay with that. And some people are like, nah, we'll just, schedule for another day. But again, that's not really a thing in HEMS. So if you decide to take a flight, we have these things called en route decision points that we train on. And they're decisions that you make on the ground with your crew of if we get to this certain altitude and airspeed combination because the weather is starting to deteriorate, that is our stop point. We've already made the decision on the ground that let's say we get to 500 feet because we're ducking under clouds and we slow down to 90 knots because the visibility is getting bad. If we hit the combination of those two things, it's a stop. It's a no-go. We have to do one of the options that we have other than continuing the flight. So having those predetermined en route decision points, or we call them EDPs, is really helpful to make decisions while you're flying, rather than trying obviously you still have to kind of assess the situation and determine what you are going to do thereafter. But having that predetermined point really makes the decision a no-brainer. Where, all right, guys, we hit 590, we're not continuing, we have to do something else. So those options are turning around, right? We can go back to where we came from if we know the weather is better going back the other direction. If you turn around and you see that the weather going back the other direction is also not looking great, we can divert, maybe even divert to an airport that's closer to the hospital. That's going to get us to the patient to the destination. We could land. The nice thing about a helicopter is we don't need runways. So if there's a nice big field down there that we can putter down, let's say if there was a pop-up thunderstorm or something that happened where there's lightning or hail or other, severe turbulence that starts occurring, we have the option to just put it down and wait it out. The final option that we would have is committing to what we call double IMC, or inadvertent meteorological conditions. In that event, that is a last and final resort. We train pilots to make more conservative calls and to prioritize doing one of the other three things prior to committing to going into that bad weather and admitting to air traffic control that you messed up and that you need help. So we do train very thoroughly on that procedure and check on that procedure as well for VFR visual flight rules pilots, but to make sure that if they did get into that condition, that they can survive it. So that's kind of the thought process. And while you're flying, if you're choosing one of those options, there had been definitely times that I had to divert, typically to an airport close to the hospital because of a thunder cell or something that developed more rapidly than what was forecasted en route. And I just saw this huge cumulonimbus cloud starting to develop right kind of where we were supposed to be going. And I was like, oh man, that wasn't supposed to happen for a couple of hours. I really thought we had more time before that weather was supposed to roll in. And at that point, it's just a conversation with the crew, right? You talk to the crew, you say, hey guys, looks like the weather, it's building up faster than expected. And the radar is not showing any precipitation at this time. However, seeing how fast that cumulonimbus cloud is growing, that's going to be pretty turbulent under there. Wind shear potential, landing on top of a hospital with a pinnacle pad adds an additional risk to, landing underneath a cloud that's fast developing. So in that case, we just said, can you guys call the hospital and just rally an ambulance to meet us at the airport that's next to the hospital versus committing to landing on that pinnacle pad where the shifting winds might be a lot more hazardous and insidious than landing at an airport.
So, Diane, how do you teach and or advocate really for those subtle pressure points from dispatch and clinicians, or indeed even, those mission creep pressures really to accept the mission? It's a critical care patient, or we've just got this short window of time. You need to take the mission. Can you maybe speak to and guide us through how you advocate and train other pilots to really, like you say, put in some hard nose where it's appropriate, and indeed have some clear decision points just to guide you through to avoid those mission creep kind of pressures, really?
Sure. It's insidious, right? Pressure to fly is so sneaky in the sense that if you don't know how to recognize it and recognize when you are putting pressure on yourself, when you are receiving pressure from maybe someone who's not on the aviation side of things, but usually it's on the business side of things. Maybe a hospital-based program that is worried about the bottom line versus worried about safety of flight and don't fully understand the full picture of a no-go decision and why a pilot is doing it. So with self-pressure, I think every pilot has experienced it. You know that at the other end of that call, someone is having the worst day of their life. Uh, the clinician side of things really, and the request side of things really try to avoid telling the pilot who the patient is, how old they are, especially. But when we get that weight in for the weight and balance, you know it's a kid if they're 100 pounds, right? So that automatically adds additional pressure to, the weight of saying no is feels a lot heavier, feels a lot greater. So when it comes to training on how to say no, first of all, I think that the industry has changed a lot. The culture of the industry has changed a lot. It used to be that you would receive a lot of pressure from management to take flights. And nowadays, it has been such a culture shift, especially in large EMS companies like the one that I currently work for, who has thousands of pilots, right? And hundreds of bases across the US, 400 aircraft that they're managing, all every single day, deciding if they're going to take or turn down a flight. So when it comes to pressure, I do think that especially the company I currently work for does a really fantastic job of teaching the pilots when they get hired that we are paying you to say no. And that is the hardest thing to do in this industry is to say no, to turn down a flight. In really any task where you're the pilot and you're being paid and told to go take a flight, not just in HEMS, but other parts of the industry where, there's a lot of money on the line and there's pressure to get the job done. So with HEMS, there's just that added pressure of knowing that somebody could potentially pass away because they didn't get care soon enough. So we do tell pilots, obviously don't make no-go decisions lightly, but we're going to give you the tools to be able to and the support to be able to say no, where you are not going to get a call asking you why you turned down a flight. We have to put trust in the pilots to be able to make those go, no-go decisions. And I think that really starts in training, where we create scenarios and examples of situations that the pilot might get put in. We come up with different scenarios and weather reports and in-flight diversions. And we're very fortunate enough to have very amazing simulators where we can actually, deteriorate the weather slowly and see where the pilots are making these decisions. Okay, yeah, the weather's starting to look bad. Okay, what are you going to do? At this point, what are you going to do? And then we deteriorated even more, and we deteriorated even more. And they're like, okay, yep, I'm going to put it on the ground. There's a nice big field. All right, go ahead and do it. And having the pilots actually exercise those decisions and those EDPs in training, they're far more likely to be able to make those decisions in real life.
So let's pivot slightly and look at CRM because I think, to your point, there is this symbiosis of communication between the medical crew and the aviators or the pilots. So let's just look at what good CRM looks like, actually, Diane, if that's okay, and indeed what excellent communication looks like. Could we get you to maybe walk us through and indeed listeners through, what you teach around how excellent communication, maybe that closed loop feedback, sharing the mental models, continual updates, good pre-brief, good post-brief, and just having, that permission to speak up. Could I get you to unpack that?
Sure. Yeah, crew management starts with that pre-brief and your communication with your crew. We've standardized at our company the crew briefings so that people aren't doing or pilots aren't doing variable briefings with the crew, so that no matter what base you go to in our company, you're going to see the same briefing documents that you have to go through, fill out, and brief with the pilot. So I think crew management starts with first getting the crew comfortable with you, right? If you're a new pilot and you step into a new base, these people don't know you. they have no idea what your communication style is. They don't know how you handle certain situations. They don't know how you communicate yet. And all of that happens just over time and doing flights together and understanding the individual, not just broadly, this is how you communicate. There are so many variables with individual people and how they receive information and how they give it. Even down to how do you like a checklist read off, right? In the US, and I think in the UK, you guys always do dual pilot operations in HEMS. In the US, we do only pretty much single pilot operations where it's just one pilot and then the paramedic and the nurse in the back. So that communication piece, not just, knowing how to utilize your resources as in like our comm center or our operational control, but really briefing with the crew and talking to them about the way that you receive information and the way that you communicate and going out and practicing with one another. So for example, crew communication during a double IMC event, inadvertent meteorological conditions. So same scenario that we just talked about. The weather is deteriorating and we don't have the option to turn around, land, or divert somewhere. We have to go into the clouds and admit that we're in trouble and declare an emergency. A lot of our aircraft, our VFR aircraft, they're all set up to be able to fly instrument conditions, and all of our pilots are instrument rated pilots. But the majority of our bases are visual flight rules bases. So going into the clouds and going in over an IMC is an emergency situation. Survivable, but it is still an emergency that you have to declare. And the crew can just as easily get freaked out, being in the back, very vulnerable, and having to trust that the pilot knows what they're doing. So we drill quarterly exercises with double IMC procedure. The individual bases, crew, and the pilots are required to do one every quarter. And that involves maybe when they're returning from a patient flight and they're going back to base and they have a little bit of time, they simulate. They don't actually go into the clouds or put foggles on or anything. Obviously, they're single pilot crew. But they practice, all right, guys, we just went into the clouds. Let's pull out our double IMC template. What's our minimum safe altitude? And can you walk me through the checklist? And if they do that every quarter, at minimum, they have to do it every quarter. They get a little bit more of a rapport with each other and understanding how they communicate. Because the first time you want to start reading that checklist with your crew is not when you're already in the clouds, right? It's something that should be rehearsed. It should be something that's studied. Getting the crew up to speed on how to read approach plates also is very helpful. The crew can be very vital in reducing pilot workload in a lot of these situations. In the briefing, you talk about deteriorating weather. If we get to this point, right, they talk about the EDPs, they make that decision on the ground, and making sure that the crew also understands weather decision making, because it is 3 to go, 1 to say no. So those two crew members need to be really well versed in how to read weather and how to interpret it and how to make those decisions on what they're comfortable with. Because it could go either way. They could either not really understand how to read the weather and make no-go decisions when really, it's probably, they're making a very conservative decision, but you have no choice but to go along with their no-go decision if they don't feel comfortable. Sometimes that's because of a lack of understanding of weather. And then vice versa, they could be like, yeah, let's go, and be really gung-ho, when really it needs to be a no-go decision. And of course, there's two other people that can be the full stop on that decision. But crew management has everything to do, like you said, about the pre-brief, during flight, practicing with each other. I always teach my pilots to communicate as much as they can with the crew, especially if they're new to each other. Saying out loud what they're doing, what they're thinking, why they're doing certain things during their high recon, when they're landing at a scene, when they're landing at a hospital, saying out loud the obstacles that they're seeing, saying out loud where the wind is coming from, saying out loud what their trajectory is, if where their down one is, where they're going to turn final, and having the crew eyes up outside, also looking for obstacles. You always say there's a sterile cockpit in effect when you're in critical phases of flight. And I always say sterile cockpit's not silent cockpit. It means that if you see something, you need to say something and speak up. If you're seeing a wire that I'm not saying out loud, I need you to be my extra set of eyes back there. And I think especially when it comes to after you've picked up the patient when you are leaving that scene or that hospital, it's critical when you're departing that there's heads up, eyes out. And it's really difficult, especially if the crew's just got a patient on board and they're working on the patient, for them to, take 2 seconds to, a couple, well, not really 2 seconds, but a couple of seconds for the departure to bring your heads up and eyes out, and uh, work on the patient once we are out of that confined area, because I don't have eyes in the back of my head. They are my eyes. They can clear my tail. They can help me make sure that I'm above that tree line, to the right or the left of the aircraft before we continue forward. And there's such a critical piece in that safety and that management of very complex environments that you find yourselves in.
Listen, I really like that, Dan. And as you're saying, a sterile cockpit is not a silent cockpit. I really like that saying because essentially, like you said, you've got to democratize other people's vigilance, other people's attention, because they might be seeing something you're not seeing, and giving people permission to speak up and speak into your practice is key, as you were saying. I also like what you were saying around the power of visualization, but also anticipation. So if this happens, we're going to go through this checklist, but sharing that with the wider team so that there's especially with, like you said, flash teams or teams which aren't used to working together, and actually allowing people to understand what your pivots will be, what your defaults will be, what your preferences will be, where you will default to a checklist, which is exactly the right thing to do, but ahead of time. And we used to start the critical care shift and say, and actually I always ask the doctor, what's your preference for blades, for Macintosh blades? Where do you like to be? What do you like to do? And actually, it was really nice if they were saying, look, always if you feel like I'm getting overwhelmed, tap me on the shoulder, or you tap me, and we'll cover each other. We'll step back, and default to Plan B where Plan B is part of Plan A. And we can verbalize Plan B and Plan C as part of Plan A, so everyone is on the same page for those defaults. Just as a pivot to that, Dan, and before we move on, could I just get you to maybe just unpack for us just an example from your practice where you saw either good or bad CRM at play, and just everything we've spoken about, where it does involve mitigation of risk through that healthy communication.
There's a lot of barriers to communication when it comes to the relationship between the crew and the pilot. Everybody is very different, uh, different values, different ways of doing things. And when there is a point of contention where two people do things two different ways and don't come to a common ground on how something should be done, I think that's where there's a little bit of stress involved with having to stand your ground with what you believe in and what you believe to be right. And you're living with the crew while you're on shift. You're having meals together. You're hanging out together in the break room. You're watching Netflix together. You're studying together. You're in this environment where you're basically living like they're your family. So when there's different personalities that collide or clash, I think that can be one of the biggest detriments to a crew, unless the two people can put aside their differences and try to come to a common ground for the safety of the flight. For example, I can't really think of one off the bat with a medical crew member, but I can talk about an experience that I had with another pilot. And two pilots who are very headstrong, and both are right in what they want to do or how they're handling a situation. That becomes a very stressful time in the cockpit. I was uh, at a previous company, flying the AW109, the Augusta Westland. And we were out on a training flight. However, he was not a training captain. It was kind of like the company understood that it was a complex aircraft, multi-engine aircraft. when we were flying the organ transplant teams. And as an added kind of measure for safety after you passed your check ride, they still wanted another seasoned pilot to fly with newer pilots in the cockpit for a couple of flights, just to make sure that they fully understood the mission and the way the company wanted to do things. But they weren't training captains and they weren't check airmen. They were just another pilot in the cockpit, another set of eyes, if you will. Doing that during the organ transplant flights, you did not have crew members. You just had the medical team with the organs in the back, and then it was a single pilot operation. So it was an added measure, not a bad one, but there was no regulations written down for the company of how to do this effectively and what the responsibility was of the other pilot. And obviously, the person who was flying was the PIC. And returning from one of our flights, the pilot kept reaching down and turning off the stabilization systems. And this wasn't a training flight. I was the PIC and he's supposed to just sit there and observe. And I looked at him and I said, "Can you please turn that back on? We're coming into land. Please don't turn off the stabilization systems." Even though, I could fly it just fine without it. And I turned it back on and he reached down and turned it back off. And at that point, I realized that this pilot was not going to let me keep this on. And we were coming into busy airspace. And at that point, I made the decision not to fight him on it and just to fly without it and to land and say that we were going to talk about it when we got on the ground. At that point, I went to the chief pilot when we landed. Well, as soon as we landed, he ran out of the helicopter and went straight to the chief pilot himself and told him, I think I did something that pissed off Diane. Which, rightfully so. I think I had a reason to be upset about that. And unfortunately, the company at the time didn't really have my back on it. They said, well, he has more experience than you, blah, 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 which I did not feel was the correct way to handle that situation. And I did not agree with the outcome of that situation. So there had been times like that, with other pilots where I had to kind of concede to, their poor judgment for the safety of flight. Because if I had just continued to fight with him while we were coming into land, that's obviously no good for anybody. So I kind of had to make the decision to just let him have it and fly the aircraft and get to the ground safely. So that's the only situation I can really recall where I had some contention in flight, where there was poor communication, poor judgment involved that I had to kind of, figure out the safest option thereafter.
So, Dan, as you said, there's multiple factors at play, not only from a CRM perspective, and I think what makes HEMS or helicopter air ambulance missions challenging is the 24/7 nature of the operation. So, night flying, day flying, weekends, earlys, lates, nights. But and there's multiple human factors at play actually. Fatigue is a regular attender, distraction, task saturation and sometimes all at once. There's this it's never linear. There's always multiple, and it can make it challenging. But as a regular attender to the party, Diane, could I get you to maybe, unpack for us the biggest threats, the biggest human factors threats you see on mission, and indeed maybe how you tackle them?
Sure. I have always said that fatigue management is probably the most important aspect of being a HEMS pilot. Learning how to manage your sleep circadian rhythm, constantly shifting back and forth between day and night shifts, um, deciding how you're going to tackle that as an individual, because everyone's a little different on how they do that to manage their fatigue. I personally, at the base that I was flying at, we worked 14 days on, 14 days off. And kind of against my, uh, I guess, desires or thought process, we would always shift every other hitch, days or nights. So 14 days, 14 nights. The 14 nights was difficult. I personally don't like being shaken awake to go on a flight, I shift my sleep schedule a couple days before I go on shift. So I'll try to stay up as long as I can, maybe 2 days before I'm supposed to go on shift to try to get my body to adjust to that new sleep schedule. Some people live their lives and have families during the daytime, and then they go on night shift and they sleep when they can. But if it's a busy night, they could potentially go all night without sleeping. And there have been real studies that show that 24 hours without sleep is the equivalent of having somewhere around 4 to 6 beers in your system when it comes to your coordination, when it comes to your judgment, your decision making, um, uh, general awakeness, and alertness to be able to make these difficult decisions that we've been talking about this whole time, right? So think about having 4 to 6 beers in your system, and you get a flight, and you have to adapt to those dynamic decisions and environments that you get put in. So, like you mentioned, fatigue, I think is the most important and the most detrimental aspect to HEMS flying when it comes to the 24-hour shifts. I know the crews would have 24-hour duty time, like shifts. So but the paramedic and the nurses would. But as the pilots, we would work 12-hour duty days with potential extension up to 14 hours, depending on, potentially undetermined, or unprecedented or predicted situations that it's going to cause you to go over your duty times potentially. And in that case, you just have to add additional rest time onto your night. So I would definitely say fatigue, learning how to manage it, and what works best for you as an individual. For me, like I said, I flipped my sleep schedule a couple days before. Going back to going to a day schedule when you're off shift is just as difficult. Um, so doing it the first day is not really great. I had to, like I mentioned, had to do it a couple days before I came on shift in order to feel like my sleep schedule had truly shifted and I wasn't too tired all the time. There are some bases that do, 3 nights, 4 days on a 7 and 7 schedule. Some of them do 7 days on, 7 days on, 7 day off schedule, and then they every other hitch would switch days and nights. But I think the 14s was was a very difficult thing. So in that case, switching in the middle of a 14-day shift. So if they did a 7 days on, 7 days day, and then 7 days night, you would need a day off in between to flip your sleep schedule for duty times and rest, regardless. So it didn't really work out where we would be able to do that because we needed constant coverage. So that's where it got kind of tricky, I think, being on that schedule. But taking care of yourself, taking care of your body, the risk management starts at home with how you take care of yourself, your mind and your body. Um, I have known pilots to just sit there and pound Monster Energy drinks and Taco Bell and Mountain Dew or whatever it is, and I'm like, you're not taking care of your body. And how is your body adjusting to these very difficult, I guess, schedules? And for me, I eat very healthfully, I exercise very often, and I keep myself and my body and my mind in shape to be able to do that job.
Yeah, and that was actually my next question, actually, Dan, which was how you reset, because I think something which is lesser spoken about and indeed unpicked is how people do reset. Like you said, there's 14 night shifts, and there has to be a biological reset almost, and stepping away from work, and like you said, just maybe resetting your diet, your exercise, and the way the rhythm of sleep. So maybe could I get you to speak to how you reset from such a heavy schedule of maybe unsocial hours?
Sure. I've been an avid yogi for a little over a decade now when I started practicing. I do meditate regularly. I've kind of gotten out of the habit a little bit lately, and I think I need to get back into it, but it's a practice, right? Some times I go through seasons of doing it often, and some, life gets busy and you kind of forget about the whole mental health aspect of your life until it catches up with you. So for sure, when I was flying the line and dealing with mentally exhausting situations often, and also very emotional situations, like you mentioned. I mean, I think one of the times that it hit me the hardest was flying an RSV baby that did not make it through the flight. Uh, those things kind of, you put your head down and you do your job, and the med crew is working on the patient, and you're hearing the drills and, the cries and all the things. And uh, you kind of have to just shut it off and do your job and fly the aircraft safely. But when you get home is when that stuff really starts to hit you, right? Um, Losing a patient, I'm sure on the clinician side, it's just as, if not more, hard on your mental health when it comes to those things. So, I personally, I talk about those situations. Some people are not verbal when they go through difficult times like that. I have my person, I have my people that I can talk to about those things. But I've always said that there are not enough resources, and the culture of aviation um, has not made it a safe place for pilots to talk about mental health. And I think that's super important. And it's also starting to change. I know the FAA just came out with some new regulations when it comes to antidepressant medication, and certain regulations that were a little archaic that basically prevented pilots from receiving mental health help, or too scared to seek help when they were going through difficult stuff, even if it might be divorce or death in the family, or something that's outside of the HEMS world, that could be affecting their performance at work. Those things still come with you when you show up to work, having stressors at home. And if you don't have the outlet or the way to deal with those things, they can really follow you into your flying and into your work. So, and that's also very insidious. You can sit there and say, "Hey, I'm good to go," but deep down or in the back of your head, you've got something going on. It severely affects your performance, and I've experienced it with a time that my friend was in a helicopter crash in the Grand Canyon. The day before, nobody had comms with them at the bottom of the canyon. There was no line of sight communication. So it was very difficult to get updates and figure out whether or not they were still alive, if they had been rescued yet. And the next morning, I was tasked with doing a skydive operation, which I'd never done before, taking jumpers up to like 14,000 feet. It's January, it's cold. I'd never done that kind of mission before. Um, and I should have said, I need to call off work. I'm not in the headspace to be able to fly safely right now. And instead, I pushed it down. Yeah, let's do it. Let's go. I can totally compartmentalize, no problem. Which was not true. It was very insidious. I climbed into the wrong drop zone. I came into land with a wicked tailwind, didn't realize it until I looked to my right and saw a big old flag just opposite direction. Forgot my gloves, so I got up to 14,000 feet and it was so cold I almost lost dexterity in my hands. All of these things kept creeping in and mistakes were being made. And I think that was, one of the most telling flights for me when it came to really truly assessing my mental capacity to be able to do the job safely. Because when I landed and I just took note of all the little mistakes and the things that happened, I was like, wow, next time I'm going through something, I'm definitely going to call off work. I didn't realize that it was affecting me this much. And I think that was the biggest teller for me and biggest learning experience of having really in real time seen it and assessed it and debriefed myself where, luckily nothing bad happened. And at the end of the day, I went home. But from then on, I promised myself that if I was ever going through something stressful at home, um, that could potentially creep into the safety of flight, that I would stand my ground and say no. Um, so, taking care of yourself is super important. Mental health is super important. Seeking help when you need it is super important. Eating healthy, taking care of your mind and your body is kind of where I put my priorities right there.
So just as we just a final few questions actually, Diane. One would be really around, we can immerse ourselves, like you said, in our own worlds. And so one question really would be around what do maybe clinicians, doctors, paramedics, nurses maybe misunderstand about aviation constraints, particularly at scene landings? One of the challenges to your earlier point is sometimes, certainly with the primary mission, they're unplanned landing sites, so you don't necessarily have visibility or a mental model or indeed a map of, what the landing site looks like. It's not been mapped out ahead of time, the dynamic conditions of the weather, of the wind. But could I get you to speak to maybe just some of the constraints that maybe us as clinicians kind of miss really, and probably could get more insight into?
Sure. I think we touched on it a little bit when talking about heads up, eyes out, sterile cockpit versus silent cockpit. Truly understanding that the most critical phases of flight when landing or taking off from an area that you've never been to before. Having those extra eyes in the back is critical, that they do not, typically the patients stabilize prior to getting into the aircraft. And I understand that clinicians have to do their job as well. But part of their job is also to be a crew member, an aviation flight crew member. And so having, especially at nighttime, under night vision goggles, where our field of view is 40 degrees on either side, right? Same with the clinicians in the back who also are wearing night vision goggles. We only have 40 degrees of visibility if, the area is not too well lit. We have a rule at our company. We're not allowed to land at nighttime to an area that's completely unlit. We have to have some sort of lights on the LZ and a secured LZ unless they're a first responder program, which requires specialized training in that specific area. If they're going to be the first people on scene, typically on a regular flight, we are not allowed to land at an unsecure LZ where there's not people on the ground setting it up for us already. So you trust them to an extent, but you still have to, do a high reconnaissance and a low reconnaissance to determine the suitability of the spot that you're going to be landing in. Because sometimes the LZ commanders do not set it up properly, potentially right underneath high tension power lines, which has happened in our company before, that caused an accident where the pilot saw a pole but didn't see the second pole. In certain angles, especially at nighttime, power lines are virtually invisible. So unless you get sort of all angles and get the moonlight to kind of hit those wires at every angle possible, they are very difficult to see if they don't have high visibility markers on them. So when it comes to the crew coordination, I think it's critical for them to understand that they are an essential part of that high reconnaissance and low reconnaissance. The pilot only has, like I said, a 40-degree field of view, and we're constantly scanning and moving our heads to ensure that we're seeing everything. But we're, depending on the aircraft that you're in, you're either on the front right or the front left of the aircraft, and the two people in the back are so crucial to be able to see everything and every aspect and every obstacle. So we require a 360 recon at every single place that you're going to land, whether it be a hospital or a scene landing. And we've recently created an acronym to standardize it across the board to ensure that pilots are doing all the same stuff. It's slow feet, size, shape, suitability, surface of the spot. And then you talk through it. All right, size, yep, it's 100 by 100 at least. It looks like we've got plenty of space to fit there. Surface, are we worried about brownout? Are we worried about whiteout? And having the crew understand whiteout and brownout conditions, because with the way that the downwash is on a helicopter, they are going to be the first ones to start seeing that dust cloud build up from coming from the back. And they need to understand that if they see the dust already coming up, it's just a matter of a couple of seconds before it's totally engulfing the helicopter. So ensuring that they understand those hazards that we're looking for, that we need communication about, because they will be the first eyes on it. Yep, I'm starting to see a dust cloud back here, and then eventually it gets to the pilot. But they are a determinant factor on whether we should go around and find another LZ. And going through lighting, obstacles, wind, determining where the wind's coming from, forced landing areas. Maybe the pilot says, yep, that's field over there is where we're going to go. And the crew member says, well, actually look over to the left. There's like a huge place over there. Oh my God, you're right. I didn't see that before, right? It should be a conversation when you're assessing an LZ. And like I said, heads up, eyes out, and not focusing on the patient when you're on short and final or when you're departing from the area. So I think that's crucial. I think there is also some misunderstanding with clinicians on certain aerodynamic aspects of the aircraft, which, fair enough. They're clinicians, they're not pilots. And it is our job to be able to educate on why we're doing certain things, why we're departing a certain way, why we can't do a certain thing that they're asking us to do. For example, I had a pilot come through training the other week. In single engine aircraft, it's much safer to do an airspeed over altitude departure. What that looks like is you are 10 feet above the ground and you're speeding the aircraft up nose down until you get to 40 knots and then let the nose come up. We're trying to stay out of what we call an HV diagram, a height velocity diagram, which is basically a diagram that shows there's a danger zone of airspeed and altitude combinations where a safe auto rotation would not be feasible. And so departing is, if you're coming straight up, and there's so many times in HEMS or air ambulance where we have no choice but to live in that danger zone of the HV diagram. When we're landing at confined areas, we're taking off from pinnacles, landing at hospitals. We have to go straight up and get an altitude over airspeed departure. Well, during that time, when we're slow and we're low, if we have an engine failure, the chances of that ending up well are very little to none. If you're in that area, you might be able to pull something off, but it's not going to look pretty. So there were some clinicians at this pilot's base where they were too scared to do an airspeed over altitude departure because you're close to the ground and you can kind of get that relative motion feeling where it feels like you're speeding up and going faster. And the pilot had to kind of explain to them, actually, what we're doing is a much safer thing than what you're asking me to do. So I think that understanding of the aerodynamics and maybe something that doesn't seem safe to a clinician is actually the more safer option that the pilot is making.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And it's like you said, it's good to share those pearls of wisdom, both in the moment, well, afterwards, but just to really share that information. So Dan, just as we finish off, the last question, there is no magic bullet really, but and maybe there's multiple things, but is there an overarching theme that you could maybe speak to just around joint training between pilots and medical crews that might have the biggest impact on the patient, but also on crew safety?
I think the communication piece that we talked about is one of the biggest things. Understanding each other's quirks, understanding each other's communication, having that closed loop, recognizing when there's a barrier to communication that's happening, and putting aside your differences in order for the flight to be safe, whether you get along with each other in the real world or not, to be able to train with one another, not be lazy about going out and training together. I saw that a lot where I wanted to go out on a training flight, but the crew was like, "Now we'll just stay back here." Well, that's only helping me. That's not really helping them or our communication. And I think I never had a situation where a crew said, "Hey, let's go do training together." And, I'd never had anybody ask me to go train with them. And I think that it's an important piece, especially with a new crew, that you do training together and that you go out on flights together that are not associated with a mission, where you get to practice that communication piece with one another, read checklists off to each other. Yeah, the way that I like to read checklists, I'll say, okay, next. Okay, I like to hear I have 1 out of 10 steps. This is step 1, this is step 2 out of 10, step 3 out of 10. I personally like to hear numbers rather than a crew member just spouting off the individual checklist items. I like to have them wait to give me the next thing until I ask for it, so I don't get task saturated. And you don't learn those things about each other unless you practice it. And the time that you do that shouldn't be when there's a patient on board and there are distractions and there's task saturation. So I think the big key takeaway is don't shy away from training. Don't get lazy about it, right? If you're watching your favorite Netflix show, it's going to be there when you get back. If there's some downtime and the aircraft's ready to go and you have some free time, like go out and do that training flight together so that you get that communication piece, especially just if you have a new pilot at your base. Once you get a couple of missions under your belt and you understand each other and you understand the pilot and how they like to be communicated with and they understand how you communicate and how you receive information, uh, I think just, first day on hitch, let's go fly together. So I think that's super important.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and actually, there's nothing replaces that lived experience together as a team. Because, to your point around understanding preferences and communication modalities and how you like to receive information versus someone else, and getting that clear. Dan, listen, it's a pleasure speaking with you over the past hour. It's great to get your lived experience and pearls of wisdom on the podcast, and no doubt we'll be speaking to you again. But thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.